Hatsqual Tunoyap, Siams, Si Yoyokwa, Si Tachtin, Kwashamasnat, Daskahot Mishokamelk. It's great to see each and every one of you today. My ancestral name is Si Tachtin. I wanted to open up in some of the traditional words of the Skahotmish people to honor our presence and where we gather. I'm currently in Chat Lam, near West Vancouver Secondary School. It's the Squamish name for the southern slopes of West Vancouver, along with the choppy water in front of now known as Ambleside and the beach area there. So I just first of all want to thank all of you for the opportunity to come and talk to you today about shared decision making and kind of the path of how we got to shared decision making and reconciliation, and really hopefully entice some questions for all of you in terms of our critical path forward as a community, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and the responsibility that we've inherited as a community to create a better future for our students and for our communities. So I will jump right in. I wrote down a lot of notes in terms of how we would do this, and really the key message I want to relay to all of you is when we're talking about shared decision making, there's a key phrase that has attached to me, I guess, during my journeys as an Indigenous leader is nothing about us without us as Indigenous people. So I'll say that again, nothing about us without us is kind of a key phrase I would love you to go away with. And this really is a conversation, I know we're virtual, about the journey of shared decision making and reconciliation in education. And I really want to be clear that the path of reconciliation and shared decision making is not an easy one. It must be acknowledged that reconciliation and shared decision making occurs on an emotional train. I want to acknowledge the past that we've inherited, the descriptions of processes and litigations and battles and everything that has happened prior to how we got here today. In the very attempt to co-construct a new reality will inevitably invoke an emotional response in Indigenous communities and also non-Indigenous communities. And that's justifiable in people because we have inherited a flawed history. We've inherited a history that was based on assimilation and colonization. And it's not to blame anybody, but it's to recognize that history and say, this is what we're inheriting. And we have a responsibility as today's generation to pass on a history that is much better for our future generations. So really, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sincerity and the attempts around guiding a framework around shared decision making and reconciliation. And in order to do that, we really need to understand how we got here and frame the notion of reconciliation and shared decision making as it pertains to education of Indigenous peoples and education in general. So really, I'll talk a little bit about the history of how we got here in education and where we should be going and the tools that we have based on that history that we've all inherited as teachers, as leaders, as a community, and as stewards of the future generations. So I really want to start off with education for Indigenous people in Canada is deeply scarred by a long history of disastrous colonialism, racism, and residential schools. As we all know, the residential schools era started in 1970 and lasted until 1996, where more than 150,000 Indigenous students, Métis students, and Inuits were forcibly removed from their families and assigned to schools where they faced emotional, psychological, and physical abuse, and many of the children never returned. Family units were lost, parents lost their parenting skills as children were no longer in the family homes, in the family community. And they were also forbidden, the children, to return back to their communities, and a lot of them stayed at the schools. Indigenous children and adults were also forbidden to practice our culture and our language and our customs and our traditions. So we have an era of over 126 years of residential schools and other legislative oppressions that have clearly legislated and forced assimilations of Indigenous people. Now that's a lot. That's a lot of history to kind of take on. But it's something that if we're going to embark upon shared decision making, that we must understand. So we know where we're starting from. We know the tools that we can achieve. And I think we can all agree that policies of assimilation and forced colonialization is not shared decision making, and it's not reconciliation. Today, Indigenous peoples in Canada as a whole, many Canadians far and wide, fully recognize that the era of residential schools and really bad Canadian legislation like the Indian Act were enormous harm to our Indigenous children, our Indigenous communities. And around that, we all know that we have a collective responsibility to start to redress some of that history and embark upon a journey of reconciliation. Research has indicated that the residential school system resulted in a widespread upheaval of Indigenous communities and reduced educational attendance and outright mistrust of schools and educational institutions. We just have to look at the statistics and kind of show that, less Indigenous peoples are more likely to go to post-secondary schools, that our education graduation rates in secondary schools in the K-12 systems is lower than the Canadian average. Something we already know, but it's really as a result of kind of that history that we've all inherited. Numerous organizations, national, provincial, and local, are working to ensure that there's adequate opportunities. And I just really want to commend all of those institutions, all of those organizations, including yourself and your school district, on the work that you're embarking upon to change that era of residential schools and disastrous kind of eras of colonialization. And you should all be commended for the work that you've done. Many institutions and organizations all agree that Indigenous identities, cultures, language, and values and ways of knowing and knowledge systems should all flourish within our education systems. Organizations like the First Nations Education Society, known as FNESC, Independent Society, aim to improving the educational outcomes of all Indigenous peoples in British Columbia, works with the partners of the province and the school districts and the post-secondary institutions to kind of continue that. We know the good work of the school districts such as West Vancouver to improve the educational outcomes of our Indigenous learners and the relationships with local Indigenous First Nations such as Squamish Nation. We should also look at the recent work of our enhancement agreement as a pathway and a critical pathway forward in terms of shared decision making and reconciliation. So I do want to congratulate everybody that's been involved in that, the advisory committee, the school board, the school district, everybody involved in that, and continue to do the great work. But again, I want to go back to how did we get here? When I think about, in order to understand the current factors that we're facing impacting Aboriginal education in Canada, and especially in West Vancouver, it's important to provide a broad overview of key policies and documents and points of history that provide a history of Aboriginal education during colonial times and will provide an understanding of what Indigenous control of Indigenous education looks like and why shared decision making is so important. I would like to start our journey kind of in the middle in 1969, where then the Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau released a policy to make changes to the Indian Act that governed all aspects of Indigenous life. The white paper was widely viewed as Canada's attempt to eliminate Indigenous rights and another effort to legislate and fully assimilate Canadian Indigenous peoples. The white paper was widely viewed as a critical document in Indigenous history, and not only demonstrated how far Indigenous peoples and the government were in terms of their respective views around governance, but it was also a significant shift in Indigenous and government relations. The white paper resulted in a strong Canada-wide, coast-to-coast-to-coast mobilization of Indigenous people to produce policy responses and papers that affirmed Indigenous rights and sovereignty and the notion of shared decision-making. The white paper proposed to eliminate the Indian Act, dissolve the Department of Indian Affairs, abolish Indian status, convert reserved lands to private property so that can be sold by its band members, transfer responsibility of Indian affairs to the province, provide funding for economic development for Indigenous peoples, and appoint a commissioner to address outstanding land questions and land claims with Indigenous peoples around existing treaties and non-extinguished lands. So it's such a big, but the reason I bring this up is because it was that was one of the biggest catalysts where Indigenous people then came together and spoke with one voice. Prior to that, it was at the nation level, the Indian band level, the regional level, the tribal council level, but the white paper really solidified the Indigenous voice across Canada, and we stood with one voice and said this is not right and we should do something different. As a result, in 1970, the red paper was developed, which was the response, the Indigenous response to the white paper. The red paper highlighted that the colonial policy, such as the Indian Act, should be reviewed but not repealed until there is consensus affirmed by Indigenous peoples. We're still in that discussion today, many generations and decades later. The document voiced a national Indigenous rejection of the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs. And over the years, the name of the department governing Canada's fiduciary obligations to Canadian Indigenous peoples has changed the name. Today it's now known as Indigenous Services Canada. And I can just tell by the leaders that come to me and what acronym they use on what era they were a leader in moving forward. But all colonial government policies leading up to the 1970s were unilaterally imposed by non-Indigenous settlers. It was very much a paternalistic relationship where the government clearly stated that they thought they knew best on what Indigenous people should be doing and how they should be governing themselves. The red paper asserted that Indigenous peoples must lead and be involved in all aspects of policy and practices pertaining to Indigenous life. Again, that notion of nothing about us without us. And it's really a clear statement again around there must be shared decision making and reciprocity as it relates to governance of our peoples and especially our children. And education was in the same boat. 2 years later, in 1972, the National Indian Brotherhood, now known as the Assembly of First Nations, released and published a document called Indian Control of Indian Education. The key message from this document was that Indigenous parents, families, and communities, as well as Aboriginal Indigenous organizations, must be involved in all aspects of Indigenous education. Indian Control of Indian Education was written in the midst of the residential school era. Residential schools were alive and well at that time. And it shows how Canadian Indigenous people were rightfully so asserting their rightful role to be fully involved in all aspects of education of their children and their community members. The time for radical change around Indigenous education was here. The aim of the document was to ensure that the philosophy and needs of Indigenous people were met in all educational institutions, even if it was residential schools. At that time, in 1972, there was an assertion from Indigenous people that we believe in education as a preparation of total living, as a means of free choice on where to live and work, as a means of enabling Indigenous people to participate fully in their own social, economic, and political and educational advancements, and move away from the paternalistic relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canada. A long history of harmful education efforts opposed by settlers upon Indigenous people has resulted in a strongly maintained position that Indigenous leadership is vital and critical to all Aboriginal and Indigenous education. You'll notice that I'll use every Indigenous word, First Nations word, I'll use Indian, Aboriginal, and I do that as a notion that all of these words are meaningful in terms of the context of the history. And so I just want to kind of put that preamble there. I want to jump past the 80s. There was a lot of things happening in the 80s around First Nation status and all of that, which is also important history, but it's kind of not relevant to the educational discussion. So I'll jump to 2007, which I would say is kind of more the modern era, where we had the modern Indian residential school agreement. So in 2007, Canada's largest class action settlement on the Indigenous Indian Residential Schools Agreement was signed by the federal government and the survivors of the schools and the church organizations. And the following year, as we all know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was launched with the mandate to inform Canadians on what has happened. As we all know, the TRC and the commissioners traveled across Canada hosting events where they would listen to survivors and hear their stories. In 2008, the United Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People, known as UNDRIP, was also endorsed at the United Nations level. And in particular, for our discussion, I want to highlight Article 14 of UNDRIP that states that Indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their education systems and institutions and provide education in their own languages in a manner that's appropriate to the cultural methods and teaching of learning. Also, that Indigenous individuals, particularly children, have the right to all levels and forms of education within the nation state without any discrimination. The other point is states shall, in conjunction with Indigenous peoples, Indigenous groups, take effective measures in order for Indigenous individuals, particularly children, including those living outside their communities, to have access, when possible, to an education in their own culture and provided in their own language. The other big aspect of the United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is the notion around free, prior, and informed consent. And this is really important around shared decision making. That shared decision making and engagement or consultation with Indigenous peoples should be free. It shouldn't cost anything. It should be prior to any major actions taken. And the Indigenous groups and all groups involved should be informed so that they can get to a notion of consent, that they're consenting to the work that's happening. A lot of government and a lot of discussion at the federal and provincial level see free and prior informed consent as a veto for Indigenous peoples. And it's been stated time and time again by our Indigenous organizations and many of our First Nations is that it's not a veto, it's a notion around cooperation and getting to a consent-based decision making. The notion around consulting and accommodating First Nations, that tired notion of consultation and a big C consultation around major projects and other things that happen in our traditional territories and homelands is gone by the wayside, and now we're looking at an era of engagement and consultation along with cooperation. So you can see how the narrative is changing over the decades and over the generations of Indigenous Canadian relationships. I now want to jump to 2010 and look at the revised First Nations control of First Nations education. You can see the terminology changing. It was the Assembly of First Nations updated versions of Indigenous control or Indian control of Indian education, the paper. And it was titled First Nations Control of First Nations Education. And then again, the chiefs in Assembly across Canada and the Assembly of First Nations asserted that in the full spirit and intent of the 1972 paper, that has never been supported in a meaningful way by the federal government and any successive governments, in that they continue to fail and support and fully implement and comprehend First Nations learning environments and envisions that was stated long ago in 1972. So in 2010, basically the leaders and Indigenous leaders of Canada again told the federal and provincial governments in Canada that they weren't living up to the spirit and intent of the document in 1972, that we still had a long way to go. and that nothing was done and people were failing to uphold Indigenous control of Indigenous education. Going on to 2015, 5 years later, and we all know after many years of conflict engagement and hearing the stories of residential school survivors, we had the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The final report, as we all know, had 94 calls to action. And many of them were directed towards educational institutions. And my message to all of you as teachers is please read the 94 calls to action and see where you fit in. I remember Justice Sinclair talking to the Indigenous leaders, and I was one Indigenous leader in the room at the time at the Assembly of First Nations when the report was launched. And he said, my fellow Indigenous leaders, don't look at the 94 calls to action and try to take them all on at once. Read them all. Pick one that hits your heart, that moves you, and be a champion for it. If you, in your lifetime, achieve it, move on to the next one that moves you. And my message is the same to you as leaders of our Indigenous students and our students. Read it, pick one, be a champion in your own way to help us embark upon this journey of shared decision making and reconciliation. In conclusion, the short overview of some of the history and some of the struggles around shared decision making and reconciliation, especially from the educational lens, provides key factors and key policies that must be considered when examining shared decision making at the local, regional, provincial, and national, and also international levels. Indigenous communities continue to assert their control around Indigenous education and all components of Indigenous life. History has taught Canadians and First Nations, Métis, and Inuits to continue to affirm Indigenous education must be led by Indigenous educators. As an interim step to achieve this goal and fully indigenize educational institutions, as highlighted by the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Report, educational institutions must continue to strive to ensure that all educational programs intended for Indigenous students are carefully co-created and co-managed with meaningful Indigenous leadership and guidance to the program. Again, co-managed, co-created, shared decision-making, I've kind of put all of those in the same bundle. So we can start seeing that these key recommendations from the TRC, from these reports, are already giving us the tools around shared decision-making, and we just have to pick them up and apply them at our own spatial scale, whatever we're working on. If it's with an individual's family, a First Nations, a regional First Nations body, right up to the international level. I now want to switch gears and kind of say, okay, how do we actually do this? Because when I talk about this, a lot of people will say, well, Chris, yeah, thank you for this advice, but how do we actually apply what you're actually saying? And I'll talk a little bit about this around the approach to ensuring that, co-creation, shared decision-making, and reconciliation is done. I encourage you all in your processes and the things that you do, if you're teaching or if you're engaging in processes around shared decision-making with Indigenous peoples, is that you must be principled. You must set up a set of principles that you will all live by when you walk into the room together. For example, our recent enhancement agreement with West Vancouver, our members of the advisory board agree to work respectfully with each other, to acknowledge and build upon the good work that was already done within West Vancouver by the many people and generations that came before us, and work towards reconciliation and shared decision-making. Any new work or goals is meant to complement and extend the work of pre-existing protocols and agreements, such as the previous enhancement agreement, and any previous work of staff and economic units. What I've learned as an Indigenous leader is that a lot of people are doing a lot of great work in silos and by themselves. So what we need to do is break down those silos and ensure that we're all working together and learning from one another, and not recreating the wheel for the sake of recreating the wheel when the wheel might just be up the road in terms of the ideas. Let's create a new wheel based on kind of previous models, I guess you would say. So some of the guiding principles that I've learned through my experience as Indigenous leader should be based around these following points. 1, all processes around shared decision making should reach consensus through respectful dialogue and decisions and discussions. 2, to provide multiple pathways for voices to be heard and multiple avenues for people to communicate. As we all know, people communicate in different ways. And some people are good in big settings, some people are better in small settings. And I encourage you to create all of those avenues if possible. To also allow the process of listening, speaking, discussing, and having, I guess you would say, uncomfortable conversations to unfold in a non-restrictive way. If you feel that more discussion needs to be had and that you don't have the critical social license or buy-in from the group that you're working with, please take the time. Please take the time to slow down and get it right. Rather than having a Eurocentric kind of framework around, we have a timeline, we need to get this to so-and-so by the end of the month. Maybe you have to tell so-and-so, if it's your boss or someone else, that we need another month to ensure that we get it right. Because if you get it wrong, we're going backwards. And it might do more harm than good. And I know everybody has good intentions in terms of the work that they're doing. We also must demonstrate in all groups involved, internal, external, that we have heard their feedback. When you ask Indigenous people, if it's an elder, if it's a student, or if it's a leader, or if it's other external groups and organizations that are non-Indigenous or Indigenous, please report back to them that you've actually heard them. I think one of the biggest mistakes that happens around shared decision making is people kind of come in and they consult, and then the people, we never hear from you again, or we never hear from the group again, and we kind of walk away as Indigenous peoples, our stakeholders, and say, I wonder what they took from our conversation. So it's always good to go back and kind of say, this is what we heard, did we hear you right? And take that time. It really shows that you're listening. And also acknowledge in any recommendations and goals that reconciliation is a shared responsibility of Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. I always hear that reconciliation is an Indigenous problem. It's not, it's all of our problems. And I think we need to recognize that when we're doing shared decision making. And it also puts the onus back on the Indigenous First Nations, that we also have a role, that it's not just a one-way street, and we must ensure that that happens. And my last word of advice around some of this is dream big, be bold, be audacious, be blue skiers. Like, think about, what it's going to look like from 100 years from now, so we can start upon that journey. So please be bold. The principles I outlined should be carried through in the operation of all meetings and forums. In particular, can we stop my... Yeah. I silenced my phone. I don't know why that's happening. So anyways, I'll start again. Is it going? These principles should be carried out in operations of all meetings and all forums, in particular with emphasizing creating a safe place that's supportive for all of those sharing. Gatherings, if possible, should be opened and supported by an elder in the local First Nations Indigenous traditions, in this case, Coast Salish or Squamish, asking for support and guidance for the work that's being undertaken. Recognizing the difficult nature of some discussions and inheriting this history and the personal levels of disclosure that might come out of the discussions, the co-leaders and facilitators of these discussions should seek permission from all of the participants if photos and video recording is permitted. Additionally, leaders shall also ensure that information around counseling and those health services are also provided to the participants, as The experience around trauma and the discussions around this history may invoke anger, it might invoke emotion, it might invoke any other health issue just around the experience. And speaking personally, when I start reading transcripts around the residential schools, it invoked a lot of anger in myself when I was in post-secondary school, learning in depthly about residential schools. And there wasn't any support, so it was just like I left the room angry. So it's really important to ensure that all participants are supported, and if there's those types of reactions, that those people get the support that they need to ensure that they feel safe, but also that they can kind of come back around and start providing solutions, because they'll have the solutions, they'll have the answers and the suggestions on how we move forward. Also, based on my experience, in addition to acknowledging the traditional territories in the place that you're on and where we have a privilege to meet, it's also good to have and open your meetings, acknowledging the emotional environment and the emotional space that you may or may not occupy. I find by acknowledging these emotional spaces, participants are more able to focus on what might be done to foster reconciliation and decision making. And within this framework and the support of an elder in creating safe places, gatherings, forums, and meetings can operate in a safe and nurturing space for those who have difficult stories to share. So my one question to all of you is, in your view as an educator and a teacher, what do you see as an opportunity and a challenge to share decision-making with Indigenous people? Tamat Kwitsi Snachum, those are my words. I hope you enjoyed my little video here, and Chinquem Antomi, I am very grateful. Wachukyo, take care of yourself. Osiam.